good evening. It's April 21st, 2025, and we're continuing our discussion collection in our Outside the Class series. This series, from the Bible Project, it covers the entire Tanakh, also known as the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. Those source videos are available for your review. They're on TheDustyFeet.com in the Outside the Class section. Because the intent of Outside the Class is for you to listen to that in-class lecture first, right? Then we expand the conversation. And we still try to keep these to about 15 minutes. Make them easy to catch up on. So we are on a quest, scroll by scroll, book by book, a journey through this collection. Just maybe with a fun and different twist. Our hope with the Dusty Feet is to foster discussion and to help build and support communities. If you are not already connected to a community or just want to share and interact, this community has 4 primary ways to interact. 1. TheDustyFeet.com. That's our primary place to find everything. You are always free to comment. 2. Substack. Link is in the description below. It's designed around the written and spoken text. It's a place to connect to ourselves and others. 3. Facebook at The Dusty Feet. These videos and other videos are also available for comment and discussion. 4. And as always, you're welcome to send an email to bob@thedustyfeet.com. These places, they will be moderated and guidelines will be set to ensure healthy, safe discussion. And as always on The Dusty Feet, this is a place where we can safely explore the endless ways of God and the interconnection of His creation. Belief understandings may be challenged, divine misunderstandings may exist, and traditional teachings might falter as we pursue connection, context, and community with God and each other here in an environment of grace and love. Oh, and of course, before we forget, if you do find these kinds of podcasts useful, please click that subscribe button. But those reminders, they just help you. But also, if you think these might be useful to others, that is when you click that like button, because that is how YouTube chooses to share these to more people if they wish. So in this series, we're going to cover the entire Tanakh, right? The Old Testament. But we're going to do it in the original order of the Hebrew Scriptures, okay? And we need to remember, the videos we're going to discuss, they're just a tip of an iceberg. They are part of a learning series that I highly recommend. And of course, all of them are available at the Bible Project. Because we're going to ask many questions about all kinds of things. Answers? That's what we'll see. Kings, first scroll. Part 1. So I've been looking forward to starting this first scroll of Kings, and right off the bat, we're going to get continued interfamily squabbles. There's more jealousy, and there are some promises kept, right? Oh, wait, before we do that, let's do what we always do. When we start a new scroll, we need to review the Bible Project's overview video, right? It's the scroll of 1 Kings. Well, actually, it's for both the scrolls of the King. So, start us off. Take a listen. Enjoy.
The books of 1st and 2nd Kings. Although they're 2 separate books in our Bibles, they were originally written as one book telling a unified story that continues on from the book of Samuel that came before it. So David has unified the tribes of Israel into a kingdom, and God promised that from his line would come a messianic king who would establish God's kingdom over the nations and fulfill the promises made to Abraham. So the book of Kings tells the story of the long line of kings that came after David, and none of them lived up to that promise. In fact, they run the nation of Israel right into the ground. The book is designed to have 5 main movements. The story begins and ends focus on Jerusalem, first with Solomon's reign and the construction of the temple, and then in this last section ending with Jerusalem's destruction and Israel's exile to Babylon. And the story leading up to this tragedy is what makes up the center 3 sections, which explain how Israel split into 2 rival kingdoms, how God tried to prevent the corruption of Israel by sending the prophets, and how exile became the unavoidable consequence of Israel's sin. The book opens with 2 chapters about the kingdom passing from the aging David to his son Solomon. And David's final words to Solomon, they're very similar to those of Moses and Joshua and Samuel to the people. It's a call to remain faithful to the commands of the covenant and to give allegiance to the God of Israel alone. But David's words ring somewhat hollow here, because David and Solomon then go on to conspire how they're going to consolidate this new kingdom through a whole series of political assassinations. It's not off to a great start. Solomon's brightest moment comes when he asks God for wisdom to lead Israel, and he even completes David's dream to make a temple for the God of Israel. Here the story actually stops and describes the design of this temple in detail, just like the tabernacle design in the Torah. There's all these gold and jewels and depictions of angels and fruit trees. It's all symbolism echoing back to the Garden of Eden. It's the place where heaven and earth meet, where God's presence dwells with his people. But no sooner does Solomon finish the temple that he makes some really horrible choices, and the kingdom falls apart. He starts marrying the daughters of other kings, hundreds of them, for political alliances. And then he adopts their gods and introduces the worship of those gods into Israel. Solomon then accumulates huge amounts of wealth. He builds a huge army. He even institutes slave labor for all of his building projects. Now, if you go back to the Torah and look at God's guidelines for Israel's kings in Deuteronomy 17, Solomon is breaking every one. So by the time that he dies, Solomon resembles Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, more than he does his father David. The next section of the book opens with Solomon's son, Rehoboam, acting just like his father. It's a very sad story of greed and lust for power. He tries to increase taxes for slave labor. And under the leadership of Jeroboam, the northern tribes reject this, they rebel and secede, and form their own rival kingdom. And so now in the story, you have the southern kingdom, Judah, centered in Jerusalem with kings from the line of David, and now this new northern kingdom called Israel, whose capital will be Samaria eventually. Jeroboam also goes on to build 2 new temples to compete with Solomon's temple in the south. He puts a golden calf in each one to represent the God of Israel. The connection to Exodus 32 and the golden calf, it's all quite explicit. From this point on, the story goes back and forth from north to south, tracing the fate of both kingdoms. Each one had about 20 successive kings, and as the author introduces each king, he evaluates their reign by a few criteria. Did they worship the God of Israel alone, or did they promote the worship of other gods? Did they deal with idolatry among the people? And did they remain faithful to the covenant like David, or do they become corrupt and unjust? And according to these criteria, the author finds no good kings in northern Israel, 0 for 20, and then in southern Judah, only 8 out of 20 get a positive rating, which connects to another huge purpose in this book, and that's to introduce the role of the prophets, key figures in Israel's history. So in the Bible, prophets were not fortune tellers. Rather, they spoke on behalf of the God of Israel, and they played the role of covenant watchdogs, which means they called out idolatry and injustice among the kings and the people. They were constantly reminding Israel of their calling to be a light to the nations, that they should obey the commands of the Torah, and so the prophets challenged Israel to repent and follow their God. In these center sections for each king, God then raises up prophets to hold them accountable. And the most prominent prophets are the northern ones, Elijah and his disciple Elisha, right here in the center of the book. Elijah was a wild man of a prophet living out in the desert, and his arch nemesis was the northern king Ahab and his Canaanite wife Jezebel. Together, these two had instituted the worship of the Canaanite god Baal over Israel. And so in a famous story, Elijah challenged 450 prophets of Baal to a contest to see which god was real. So they both build altars and pray to their gods, but only the God of Israel answers with fire. After this, Ahab uses his royal power to murder an Israelite farmer and then steal his family's vineyard. And Elijah again confronts Ahab's injustice, and he announces the downfall of his house. Elijah eventually passes the mantle of his prophetic leadership to a young disciple named Elisha, who asks for 2 times the authority of Elijah. And what's fascinating here is how the author, he's recounted 7 miraculous feats for Elijah, and then he offers stories of 14 acts of power from Elijah. Both prophets were clearly remarkable men, and they played the same role, confronting Israel's kings for idolatry and injustice. And ultimately, they were unsuccessful in turning Israel back from apostasy. In the next section, the northern kingdom is rocked by a bloody revolution started by a king named Jehu, who destroys Ahab's family. And although Jehu was at first commissioned by God, his violence just gets out of control, and it creates the spiral of political assassinations and rebellions from which Israel never recovered. Coup follows coup after Jehu, and each king follows other gods, allows horrible injustice. It all leads up to 2 Kings chapter 17. The big bad empire of Assyria swoops down and takes out the northern kingdom altogether. In the capital city of Samaria, it's conquered, and the Israelites are exiled and scattered throughout the ancient world. Now, chapter 17 is key. The author stops the story and offers this prophetic reflection on what's just happened. He blames the downfall of the northern kingdom on the idolatry and covenant unfaithfulness of Israel and its kings. And so, God has allowed them to face the consequences of their decisions. The final movement of the book tells the story of the lone southern kingdom. And here we meet some very heroic kings, like Hezekiah, who trusts God when the armies of Assyria come knocking on Jerusalem's door, or Josiah, who discovers this lost scroll of the Torah in the temple. So he starts reading it, he's convicted, and he institutes religious reforms to remove idolatry and Canaanite influences from the land. But Judah is just too far gone. The king, right in between these two, Manasseh, he's the worst by far. So he not only introduces the worship of idol statues into the Jerusalem temple, he also institutes child sacrifice. And so God sends prophets to say, the time is up. Israel has reached the point of no return. The final chapters tell the story of the Babylonian Empire coming to invade Jerusalem, destroy the temple, and carry the people and the royal line of David off into exile. And so the story ends leaving us wondering, is God done with Israel? Is he done with the line of David? Well, the final paragraph zooms about 40 years forward into the exile, and it tells a very odd story. It's about Jehoiakim, a descendant from David, who would have been king if he was back in Jerusalem. And the king of Babylon releases him from prison and invites him to eat at the royal table for the rest of his life, and the book ends. So it's not much, but it's a story that gives a glimmer of hope that God has not abandoned the line of David. So the question now is, how is God going to fulfill his promises to Abraham, to David? How is he going to bless the nations and bring the Messianic kingdom? And to answer those questions, you have to read on into the wisdom and the prophetic books. But for now, that's the book of Kings.
Oh, I love those, right? So, as we've said before, these are 30,000-foot observations, possibly leaning more towards the more well-known parts of the stories, yeah? But we're going to continue our usual expanding of the conversation. We're going to look a little deeper, maybe at least in between the cracks, right? See what kinds of stories other ones have to offer, right? These stories wrapped around stories. But I have a starting question. We can put it in a box, right? Put some other things to ponder about it. So here's the question. What kind of father was David? Most probably wouldn't even bother to ask that question. I get it. But for me, since these are not fictitious make-believe characters, that they're real people, then this actually was really a factor, right? For his wives and for his children. Does the character of the parents always get played out with the children? Probably a bit of both. Maybe a little yes, maybe a little no. So, something to think about. That's something to ponder. Talk amongst yourselves about. But there's also been a question that also, to me, it's lying underneath, right? It might be wrapped up in expectations, right? As one might even go so far as to say even traditional expectations. David's a king, right? So succession, that's part of the king territory. And so from Samuel, right, we've already had insurrection, we've had rebellion, and yet all of that still falls into that context, that framing, that cultural expectation for succession, right? That Well, start with the oldest males would succeed because remember, there's no democracy here. So these children of David, they're not really off and thinking that one of them's next. Seems to be more a matter of just not wanting to wait, right? They want it now. And it seems like we have not really drifted very far from that, right? In our culture, right? I want it now. So context. I love this word. Helps me understand any story. And one of the things that I always need to remind myself of in the Bible, this wonderful collection of scrolls and letters, is that, again, it is about real people in real time. And they, in the story, are living the direction of their lives. We are looking backwards on their lives. So, in a sense, we needed Genesis and what's gone beyond that to get us to the Scroll of Kings. Because there's another thing that continues to draw me to this impact. They draw me into these stories. And the point is, they're not sugar-coated. To be honest, I've said this before, I'm going to say it again. If we were writing our own story, we might sprinkle it with a little bit of what maybe didn't go so well in our lives at various times, but we would emphasize the better side, especially towards the end. But Scripture is it sometimes feels like it's the opposite. It's scattered with messy, with a sprinkling of good. Yeah? But if we're honest with ourselves, their lives, they're still very intertwined with ours. They made choices with what they both knew and had experienced. And, well, so do we. And I'm not sure we're better off. Just, we might have more stuff, access to knowledge, scrolls in our hands. We call them books. But I'm not sure that always comes with the side effect of better. Maybe at times, I think maybe it's the opposite. Because I'm very convinced that we do not represent to humanity as a whole the God we follow, right, any better than those in that we're reading about in these stories. I'd entertain the discussion of maybe worse. But as I said, that said, we needed Genesis to get here, right? So we've traveled this whole story. We've gotten up to this king, right? King David. It's an important part of the story, but it's only because of the backward look. What I mean by that is we get David here, right? They are living, though, in the moment, right? They don't realize that the full impact that David is going to have on the bigger picture 1,000 years later. They don't realize at that time that the Messianic line, fully grasping it, is going to go through David. They're just experiencing David right now. All of the stories around David, right? Does that make sense? So in the moment, they don't realize where they're at. Only the look back tells us. It makes it clear. We get the luxury of looking back. And then I pause and I stop and I go, well, to be honest with ourselves, we might not realize the moments we might actually be in our lives until we look backward, get to see where we were and where, just like in the stories, to see where God was. Because he's actually always in the story. It's just where he interacted or where he sat back and watched. But as the scroll begins, we're at the twilight of David's reign. And so now you get it. The context is set for next week's episode, right? This seems like an interesting way, though, to sum up this very different lives of kings, right? Because in general, I guess it's the people's expectations for the kings. Maybe this is also a little peek into how they lived. Food for thought. So looking forward to next week. I'm going to leave with the beginning of 1 Kings, chapter 1. We're going to listen to the first 4 verses. Get us off. 1 Kings 1:1. King David was old and advanced in years, and although they covered him with clothes, he could not get warm. So his servants said to him, "Let a young virgin be sought out for my lord the king, and let her wait on the king and be his attendant. Let her lie in your bosom, so that my lord the king may be warm." So they searched for a beautiful young woman throughout all the territory of Israel, and they found Abishag, the Shunammite, and they brought her to the king. And the young woman was very beautiful, and she became the king's attendant, and she served him, but the king did not know her sexually. There are so many unanswered questions here. So I just keep putting a box on the shelf. Maybe we'll get to some of the answers as we roll through here down the road. But I'm guessing some of them we're probably not. We're just going to have to wait and see. We realize David's old, the end of his reign. We've already had 2 sons that have tried to be king, and as I said earlier, they want it now. And as we get to next week, we're going to get to another son of his, Adonijah, and the story continues. I want it now. So thanks for being with us tonight as we've opened up our exploration of the scrolls of the kings on the Dusty Feet.